Hello, everyone, and welcome to a kind of first steps introduction to Unity. We're going to be looking at some software features, some of the fundamentals to starting to develop a game, as far as manipulating game objects, using scripting, and then using the project files to save prefabs. Uh, This is sort of a beginner's tutorial, so if you're interested in Unity, definitely stick around. If you feel like you know a good bit and you're already well versed, well then maybe a different tutorial is for you. But let's just get a quick introduction to Unity itself. It is well known on the internet as an accessible game development tool and thus has been used for many game projects, giving it both fame and infamy. One thing to know about actual game development itself is that it takes a long time. It requires a team of up to 1,000 in some cases. Uh, it's a lengthy process. It's often collaborative. Uh, it takes many forms over time, and it will start out ugly. That's the guarantee. Part of the process is the polishing. Uh, so it's your job as a game designer to kind of create and iron out any wrinkles that your project might develop in the creation process. But that out of the way, don't be discouraged by a perceived lack of progress, and let's make our first steps into Unity. Right. I'm just gonna start a new project. Call it Unity Demo. Okay, here we are in the default 3D project workspace. Starting this new project, I'm going to take you through a look at the elements of the UI. Down here is the project tab. This is where assets can be stored and accessed. A great first step to prepare is to create folders for the different types of assets your project will eventually need. So I'm going to create a folder for prefabs, for scripts, and another one for materials right away. And then as you kind of create more and know what kind of assets you need, always stay organized, and you might need a folder for models or animations soon enough, but I'm not going to get that in depth in this specific tutorial. Uh, and of course, if you're just working on a project, people are publishing their models and their animations and their assets online for free. You can look in the Unity Asset Store or some other websites that host just assets. But if someone posts it for free, that's basically asking to be borrowed, and just make sure to give proper credit where it's due. Alright, so next to cover is the hierarchy. Uh, these are the assets that are currently being used in the scene. So it's preloaded here with a main camera and then a directional light. These can be edited later and formatted in different ways, of course. So don't be afraid to mess with anything. And now, let's go ahead and create our first game object. I'm gonna do a plane, and that can act as our ground for the whole scene. You can use a plane or you can use a terrain if you want to mess with raising and elevating surfaces. Terrains are great for outdoor environments. So you can navigate the viewer here, as I've been doing. Relative to your surroundings, you can use the hand tool to sort of pan. And then if you right click with any tool, then you can just rotate your view in place. And scroll to zoom is always helpful in navigating the 3D space. So now that we have a game object, and now that it's selected, the inspector has appeared. So in the inspector, you can see transform is the very first option. Transform correlates to the tools next to the hand here. So this is the move tool, correlates to position. So if I take the Z axis and I'll slide it this way, now in the inspector the position is at a negative Z. And then the rotate tool correlates to rotation. So I take the Y axis here, and now the Y is being manipulated. And then scale correlates to scale, of course. If I grab the Z again, and then if you grab sort of the center or the white node, that is going to affect all three axes. And this tool is just kind of helpful for scaling and it's sort of node based specific corners, and then you can kind of grab and drag with the middle node here. And if you really like messing with nodes just in the 3D viewer space, this tool is great if you recognize the arrow as the position and the rings as the rotation. But besides that, the inspector is also home to the components of each game object. So the mesh is sort of the visual representation of the game object. If you turn it off, it becomes invisible, so you won't be able to see it all, but it still technically exists through the collider, which is how different objects detect it. So if you turn that off, any object will go through it, but you can still see it. And then you turn them both off, it doesn't actually exist, and it's an empty object at this point. So, and here is the material, which is sort of the surface of the object. It could be a solid color, it can be an image texture, and here, let's go to materials and do create material. I'm just going to call it stone, and I'll turn it to a sort of grayish brown color. And then I can also import into the materials file. From my files, here's a stone. So the albedo is sort of the image file you can attach, and then so now it has the stony texture, and you can put it on the object. So There are normal maps too. Uh, there are different like kind of maps to sort of create the illusion of depth while keeping it flat plane. Uh, those are definitely helpful in making more convincing textures if that is something you need. So I'm gonna go back to our plane here. At the bottom of our inspector, this is where you can add components, and this is sort of the meat of making a game is making your objects do certain things. So one important thing for using Unity's built-in physics engine is, here it is, it's a rigid body. Um, so like I said, uh, this is what rigid body is, just sort of how you can uh, get objects to work with Unity's built-in gravity physics engine. So because this is ground, I don't want it to be affected by gravity. Instead, I want it to be kinematic, which means that only animation or like scripting will be able to move it. So now that we have our ground, now that it is got the stony texture on it, we can add another game object. And a lot of the time, instead of a player immediately, people use capsules. And I'll reset it to the origin. We'll drag it up a bit. So we have our placeholder for the player. So I'm just going to rename it player. So as you can see, it's got the mesh render and the collider right away. So it exists. Those are two elements of making something exist, both visually and then in the physics space. I'm gonna add rigid body right away to this too. And I'm gonna open up the constraints and freeze the rotation of the X and Z so that when I'm controlling the capsule, it doesn't like tip over and roll around, and it'll still be affected by gravity though. And alright, so I'm gonna go to scripts now, and we're gonna make our player have a player controller, and it'll be just like a very basic sort of movement for our player placeholder. Let's create our C# script, call it player controller. And then I use Visual Studio to sort of manipulate scripts. So here is sort of the default script setup that Unity gives you when you create a new one. Right away, I'm just going to, in this sort of top space, which is often used for private and public floats and variables, I'm going to do a public float for speed. So what that means is when the player is going to be moving, they aren't going to be teleporting, they're going to be floating sort of through 3D space at a speed of 5. And I'll also add private This is to initialize our rigid body, so under start, do RB. And this is for more advanced force-based movement, but I'm gonna be doing translation-based movement in update here. So right away I'm gonna create a variable for how the translation-based movement is gonna work. So trans amount is equal to speed times time dot delta time, and that is Unity Engine's sort of code where just that represents time. So under the variable, I'm going to start actually making the input commands for controls. And that is just if you press W, a certain thing is going to happen. Certain thing being transform translate, meaning our object will be sliding in a direction when this key is pressed. Vector 3 dot forward times trans amount, and that is what we defined in our variable. And what we can do now is sort of take the if, and I'm going to do 4 directions. So S means sec. Yep, the command is back instead of forward. And then instead of W, we're going to do an A. It's left. And D for right. So we have our variable defined of our float, and this means we should be able to have our 4 directions to sort of slide down. So I'm going to go back here into the Unity space. I don't know what this error is. Hopefully nothing to do with the script. I think it would have shown up if that was true. But we're going to go to our player itself, and we can straight up drag our script. So here it is. Because we said speed is public, here it is in the inspector to edit. I'm just gonna go ahead and press play and see if this movement is working. Yeah. So we've got our capsule sort of using this translation-based movement here, and because it's still affected by gravity, though, if you fall off the edge, it's gonna be gone into the void. So what I can do then is in my assets here, I'm gonna go to my prefabs now, and prefabs are really easy. So if I drag my player down here and I want that to be my player on like any scene, now I can use this and it will still have the coding, and it'll have collider, the mesh intact, and I can even just put some down on our scene, and then I will have control over all of the capsules. So off they go. But yes, I'm using WASD for the directional controls as intended, And uh, that's about it for this tutorial here. I hope that was a decent introduction to sort of the different UI elements and kind of what goes into combining your objects with your scripts and using the projects tab to manage your assets. Hopefully it's a good enough push to kind of go further, because there is a lot to explore as far as uh, once you start replacing your just little capsule with a more advanced character, and even your ground with a more advanced uh, plane and terrain with different elements to interact with, and just, but yeah, that's the start of developing a game, is having something to control somewhere. Uh, that's the that's the direct basics of it. Uh, Hope you've learned a bit. If you're still sticking around, uh, good luck out there. Have fun making models, searching lines of scripts on Google coding forums. All of that. It's just a good time. Have fun creating.